Okay, so we don't have a fireside, but we're going to pretend there's one in the middle. And we're going to start off, I'm going to ask a couple of questions based on what was said so far, and then I'll open up to the rest of you to ask whatever questions you'd like. No hard questions. Yes, hard questions. So one of the things that was talked about, and I mentioned in the beginning, that there's this $100 billion gap for climate financing. And what you have been hearing across, especially small island and developing states, is that this financing gap is affecting women's rights organizations, women's empowerment groups, traditional, what we consider feminist financing, because now people are, instead of increasing the amount of money being invested into these programs, they're redirecting it. How does your approach, and whether it's data, and I love Colleen's introduction because they say, give me the data and the money will come. So we're going to start with Colleen to say, like, how can the data help us figure out, is there actually a need to stop financing one section to move into financing something else, like choose climate or choose gender? And then if the rest of you can respond to, is that actually something that we need to be worried about, that we're not going to have enough money to finance both climate activities or gender, or how should we be looking at it? So just start us off there.
Sure, not a hard question at all.
Not a hard question.
I mean, I think that for me, it's not an either or. I mean, I think climate and climate change is the big reality of our time. So, I mean, I think at a very sort of macro level, one of the big challenges, and we've seen this replicated from, as we move from development financing to climate financing, is that entire governments and states need to be tooled and capacitated. I mean, even when you just think at the very national level, ministries need to understand how to sort of adjust to this new financing reality. So, I mean, and in many ways, I feel like we in the development industry are the ones who set up those distinctions. I mean, for them, it's about, bringing well-being to local populations. So call it development financing, call it climate financing. The needs are the same. And as I said, they're accelerated because of things like COVID and because of things like climate change. What we're doing, for example, to sort of try and bridge that gap, or what I think is a little bit of a false binary, is we're starting to look at our care economy work now, for example, at the coal face of climate. So like, what does the care and climate nexus look like? So if you look at care and women's disproportionate care responsibilities and burden, how does that then actually reverberate in function to other impacts that are coming as a result of climate change? And you spoke to that a little bit around, the fund that you're working through. So I think that's a really important distinction to make, because I think in development sometimes, maybe this is a function of having been in this business for a long time, we change the jargon, we change the names, but the needs are still the same. Yeah. And they're still the same to people in the global south, and even more so with things like climate change. So I think it's, which is why I sort of said, even, it's not just a slogan, things being like Southern driven and data being open to global south communities. They, it's hard for them to enact innovations and policy changes if they don't have access to data and to good data. Data gaps in the global south are real. And so I feel like, at least from our perspective as IDRC, we try and work very much at that frontier.
Yeah, I guess just building on that, I mean, certainly from our perspective, we know that the impacts of climate change are very gendered. Women are going to be affected more, particularly rural women, and most of what MEDA does is in agriculture. So I don't see it necessarily as a dichotomy. I think it's also important when we're thinking about impact investing and gender lens investing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's for growing businesses that are sustainable, that are inclusive, that are also generating tax revenues, that can be help to fund some of these other pieces. I think too much in the development sector, we assume that that funding gap is all going to come from the north to the south, and it's not. I mean, the economies are growing, they're diverse, but I think it is difficult to separate climate and gender in particular. One of the other things that we've done is, as part of our GEM, we've added on an environment module as well. And we found that a number of different companies they were asking for it. And so building in some of those different intersections is important. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Lindsay. Jessie, Jacqueline?
I very much agree that those two are not either or. In our own portfolio, the majority of the climate finance that we have is also 2X eligible or quite strong on gender. In fact, depending on if you measure by number of transactions or by volume, it's either 60 or 80% like gender and climate overall. So it's very strong. What I really like, and I previously worked in impact investing with much smaller transactions, and now, and investing is investing, but with the DFI, you're doing much larger transactions, and that gives you a lot of leverage to push the needle on some of the practices. So, for example, in our sustainable infrastructure thematic area, we're working with, for example, companies that are putting in place large solar panel projects, and we can sit down with them, and the energy sector is very male-dominated. And we can sit down with some of these companies and set up a gender action plan and put in some practices that I'm like, what? They accepted? Like, that is amazing. So, you see real results with large companies that we're not thinking about gender, and yet, like, they are affecting the lives of millions of women. So we're bringing that in for their employees, bringing in better practices, and I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jessie.
I mean, I echo everything that Jeff had said before. The intersection is real in terms of gender alignment as well as sort of a climate focus and environmental focus as well. With so many investments, I mean, the Venn diagram is very, very overlapped. But to your point, I mean, it is challenging in terms of getting capital from investors to focus on one particular area. The question is, do they need to focus on one particular area? I often have discussions with other asset owners who are like, well, we want something that will do everything. We want climate, we want gender, we want racial equity, we want community-driven type of investment. And so it's difficult to take a portfolio approach to all of that, or a product creation approach to all of that. But I would say that if you look at, to Jesse's point, that if you look at so many of the investments, the intersections are there and real and present, and it's not really a hard step for any investor to, either if they're looking at a climate portfolio and they have a climate mandate, to look at the gender impacts, and vice versa. When we invest with a gender lens, we absolutely take into account the environmental impacts of those investments. We look at the sectoral sort of as part of our approach to investing, specifically because we understand that there is a disproportionate impact on gender. So I don't think of it as an issue in terms of implementation. You're right, it is an issue in terms of fundraising. So and labeling, so to speak.
Wonderful. So the other thing that comes up a lot is the role of businesses. And in particular, I know when we think of assets and investments and funds and portfolios, you always think large businesses. Is there a space in impact investing in GLI to include the micro, small, medium enterprises? And I ask that question because, for example, in Latin America, about 80% of the businesses that are there are small businesses, but whatever definition. Quite a few of the micro businesses, micro and small, are largely women-owned, women-led. And so trying to move them from being informal to formal, trying to get places where they can get investments into their business to grow from medium to large or from small to medium. Where do other players have a role to be able to do that? Is it in the emerging markets themselves, in the South? Is it within the North? How do we have that combination? And so starting with Jackie this time, because she's got that big picture. It's one of the easy questions today. So that big picture, what is the role for the MSME, or is there a role for the MSME in this process?
This is also coming to the work I was doing previously at EPC. It is critical that you have in-region financial partners supporting small and even micro businesses.
Mhm.
You're not going to necessarily be able to have really powerful vehicles of capital coming from the global north into specific regions, because you need that local expertise in terms of not only sourcing and finding those opportunities, but also helping those companies grow and scale, right? They need to have access to the local networks, the supply chains, the the various partners. So having in-region expertise is so critical. But you're right in terms of, well, how do we get access to funding? And I think that's sort of to Lindsay, what Lindsay's doing, what MasterCard's doing is funding funds in region is a very efficient way to get capital into those particular markets. For the global market. So I mean, I would ask Lindsay to opine on that too in terms of the success.
Sure, I mean, just building on that, certainly I think going through funds, but the other critical place is, of course, by investing in local financial institutions, which is a big part of what Mita's done. And was actually in Nicaragua a couple of weeks ago for a board meeting for one of the microfinance institutions that we actually spun out of a project of ours 20 years ago. And they're, to your point, I mean, most of their clients are women. I think it was about 80%, really strong social impact. So it's sometimes the investor doesn't necessarily need to touch the small business, like from here, touch the small business directly. It's who are those intermediaries, and having that local contextual knowledge is absolutely so critical. In terms of formalization, what I've been seeing in the sector a little bit is that there's an increasing number of opportunities, particularly through digitization. I know we need to compete with the digitization panel. That was drawing other people away, so we'll make everybody jealous. But certainly with a lot of the different platforms, and particularly in Africa, you're seeing a kind of almost semi-formal sector appear with lots of people leveraging even WhatsApp, Uber Eats, Facebook, all kinds of stuff to really grow and scale their businesses, all connected with mobile money. That gives some of the benefits of formalization being almost like the exhaust or the credit record, so that then can help make it a lot easier to access more formal finance. So there's a number of different ways that we're getting at that, but I think I jumped over.
No, it's okay, because I have a different question for them, so, but you can speak.
Jump in on this question too. I don't think it's a southern or a northern issue. It's clearly both. I mean, you're doing a lot in the US where there's also lots of needs, and here as well, frustratingly. I mean, just recently I read that 2% of venture capital goes to women-owned businesses in the US. I mean, that's shocking. Like, that's not acceptable. And the statistic is not very different in Canada. So I think we have to examine all the levels, who's doing the investments, but also like what's stopping female-owned businesses, women-owned businesses from growing. Like, there's some obstacles there. The care economy is taking up a lot of energy. It takes a lot of energy to grow a business. It takes years of, working 80 hours a week. But if you're also taking care of your children and you don't have good childcare, and you're taking care of your parents, that is a serious barrier. And that's a gender equality issue that has nothing to do with investments, but it impacts, you can see my passion here. But, so I think that's not a southern issue, that's a whole world issue.
Yeah, just something else I wanted to mention is, and you spoke to a little bit around that intermediaries, and I mean, I think what's really important and what I've really come to realize, because working on the care economy for me at IDRC, I changed hats and it was quite new. And especially when I looked at some of the work at TCEII, they kind of worried me in terms of replicating some of these models, scaling some of these models. And that's why I actually think it's incredibly important to think about if these models are necessarily appropriate in all places in the global south. Like a lot of at least in the care economy work, many of the interesting innovation or models are community-based, or they're informal workers who are either sort of trying to formalize, therefore the role of intermediaries is really important. But the other piece around that is, and this is where I think it's important to help investors, partially, because sometimes models are just exported from the global north. And so I think when we're thinking about things like care, I mean, when I started to first work on this in IDRC, I said, like, I hope we're not trying to export our elder care models to the global south, because some of those did not serve us very well during COVID. And so I think, you know, there are really important questions around fit and around things like social norms. And I think there's things in the global south that we don't want to be dismantled, that we want to be working in terms of that. So elder care models are going to look quite different in the global south, and women-led businesses around that. And so that's actually another program we're working on now with Global Affairs Canada, our Scaling Care Innovations. Is specifically, it's a $25 million program, and it's around looking at tried and true innovations in the global south and trying to figure out, okay, what are the conditions around which those could be scaled or those could be replicated? And then also working with those organizations so that they can find intermediaries and link up with investors. That'll be farther down the road, but that's also an ultimate goal, right? Otherwise, it's not going to be a sustainable innovation or model without proper financing. But I think, you know, just to finish that out, it looks quite different across different contexts in the global south, whether it's in Southeast Asia or whether it's in one part of sub-Saharan Africa or another. It's really important to work with communities and families, at least that's our experience in the care economy, is to understand, you know, what are right-sized solutions for them.
So one thing that keeps coming up is this structure, this institutional infrastructural space that we have to support gender lens investing. And FinDev is a good example. So I'm going to kind of direct the question to Jessie, and then the rest of you can respond if you'd like to. But I'll give a little story. So in 2019, the Bahamas experienced one of the most terrible Category 5 hurricanes ever. It basically flattened the Abacus Islands, which is about over 100 different islands, and they lost things like financial infrastructure, banks. They have like one ATM right now, and it's 2024 from the 2019 period. But in response to that devastation and environmental catastrophe, the government of Bahamas, they decided to have what's called a sand dollar. It was a digital currency that created for the Bahamas. They tested it in Exumas, which is another of the islands. Bahamas has over 700 islands. So when you hear me talk about different islands, that's what I'm referring to. So the sand dollar has now been in existence for about 3 or 4 years. It's got very little uptake, but the creation of it was to, again, create more inclusive access to finance without having cash be available. So if there's a disaster, we have access to cash. So this story is the kind of shape. In Canada, we've taken the position where our government has said we want to support GLI in a really strong way, through the Equality Fund, through FinDev. We are going to position ourselves in a way that we are going to support different programming that supports businesses, and it also ensures that we have a more viable future for ourselves as well. What is the role of government, in your opinion, in terms of GLI? So Canada's taken a position, like the Bahamas has taken a position. Based on your various aspects of work, what is the role of government in gender lens investing? And so I'll start with Jessie, and then anybody else can jump in as they would like to.
Well, this is a touchy question for me because so the FinDev Canada is the kind of the private sector arm of the international development group. I guess we could say, you know, IDRC is that too, and there are others. But to me, and so, yeah, like I worked 10 years in Europe, and I saw a lot of the different impact funds there. And we've discussed this before on one of our calls as well. I see that the government in Europe, the governments, obviously there's more than one, did a lot of work on ecosystem. So not getting involved with the private sector, but really focusing on how can we improve the ecosystem, and then other actors can work with the private sector. I think that's a fairly good, you know, because the government can do stuff. Well, I say the government, obviously it's not one actor, but governments can work with large, difficult, risky projects, you know, guarantees, for example, like setting up a guarantee. And Global Affairs Canada has invested in a large sub-Saharan African guarantee fund, which is amazing. Like that's the kind of role that I think government has to have to support, and that's where you can push really strongly on the needle and put some, for example, that guarantee fund can focus on GLI, can put in some very strong incentives. So that, I think in a nutshell is.
I asked you the hard question because you're a DFI, and so that's also kind of the rule that a lot of countries create these DFIs, these national development banks, with that intention to say, we don't want the bureaucracy to affect lending and those processes, so we're going to push that out to a state agency, but not really, responding to and reporting to, but not actually under their governance. So that's why you got the hard question first. Jacqueline, Lindsay, Colleen, you guys want to respond to that question? What do you think? What's the role of the government?
So, similar to that, I think so this is sort of also wearing my prior hat, for government in their capital agencies to sort of take, maybe not even their capital agencies, but other agencies to take on first loss positions, which is really, really critical to provide. If you're going to encourage investors into these space to take sort of more of a blended finance approach to a lot of different, doesn't have to be from a gender side, but could be on the climate side as well. For them to stand up and take those first loss approaches really is important to be able to encourage and catalyze external capital into these spaces. Advocacy is a huge role that the government needs to play. They need to be able to coordinate across their ministries, departments, agencies, etc. A coordinated approach. I think they have a responsibility to do that and to bring all of these amazing initiatives that the governments are launching, but bring it coordinated because there's so many natural intersections and potential avenues of efficiency and learning and assistance and you have to also think of it from the lens of from the head of a company or from an investor. Navigating government and navigating government programs is impossible. And as somebody who worked in government, I still could not understand everything that was being offered. So I think there's a responsibility too for governments to be coordinated in their strategies around initiatives like genderless investment, and the more that we can all come together to really affect those strategies would be really critical.
Awesome. Thanks, Jacqueline.
I agree with all those. So certainly incentives, de-risking, taking that first loss, and establishing an effective enabling environment are all critical. Just a piece of research we're doing on the side of the Africa Growth Fund is really looking at domiciliation and how to encourage greater investments, because a lot of DFIs won't put money into locally domiciled investment vehicles. Yeah. A lot of international DFIs, and similarly, a lot of local pension funds have to invest only in locally domiciled. But yeah. So it's hard to mix things together, and so there's been a number of discussions with different country governments or investment agencies to try to look at what are some of the comparators and what are some of the other ways to address some of these challenges. But yeah, completely agree with what others have said.
I want to read that report when you're done with it. So, Colleen.
I just wanted to circle back also to de-risking, because I think, it is an incredibly important role that DFIs can play, and often only DFIs can play that role. I heard one of the governors of the Caribbean Development Bank speaking about climate change a few months ago, sort of saying we really need the DFIs to come in and take the risks that the private sector doesn't want to take. And my first reaction was sort of like, well, we have public constituencies that governments have to answer to. So in many ways, they're more risk adverse. But on the other hand, DFIs are also part of a wider club. And I think that gender is not a homogeneous, and it's not an easy area to define. And so in my mind, even DFIs are part of a larger group of DFIs. They can learn from each other. They can set examples for each other. When one government changes and DFIs are inevitably, affected by changes in government policies, then another DFI can pick it up. I think in our own scanning work that we've been doing, and we've been doing a lot of thinking this year, we don't really know what's going to happen across the world with feminist international assistance policies. Whether or not those are going to continue to live on. And, DFIs have an institutional structure. They are influenced by state politics, but they're also they're more robust in many ways, so I think it's maybe the DFIs.
They do have a bit of
Maybe the DFI in the
independence there.
room.
No, I do agree. What's disappointing about de-risking is that often it's not enough to get private investors.
Mhm.
And so even when you de-risk, they're like, yeah, but we also need this and this and this, and rating and standardization and deal size, and it's too complicated, we can't do it. So I feel like there's too much that's been put on de-risking to attract private investment, but just taking on more risk, yes, fully. Couldn't agree.
So we've got about 10 more minutes. I want to give the rest of you a chance to ask some questions. Who has the hardest question? Anybody wants to? Who has the easiest question? We'll start with you.
A bit more on the application side of this. Like this was really.
Sorry, could you just tell us your name and before
Hi, I'm Lorianne. I work at International Justice Mission Canada, which is an NGO. And so my question for all of you, we're going to go to our offices, not tomorrow because it's another day of conference, but Friday and then Monday. Like, is there something that each of you would want us to action on? Like, this was very informative, but like when you're thinking, okay, Canadian NGO, what can we go home and do based on everything you've shared? Or, if there's a professor in here in the room, like, what should they be talking about? Like, what do you want to go out from this room?
I have one. I mean, I think it's not maybe for all NGOs, because I know folks work in a variety of sectors, but one of my maybe personal pet peeves is that we do a lot of economic development and private sector development programming. And at the end of it, there is nowhere near enough of an investment readiness lens on it. It's all done through, we've all done PMFs, and are you getting the right indicators? And those things are important, but because NIDA's had a foot both in the NGO GAC implementation camp as well as the impact investor camp, when you go to maybe the more development meetings, there's a lot of interesting discussions about how do you do private sector growth, market systems development, that kind of thing. When you go to the impact investment conferences, everybody's looking for a technical assistance sidecar, as they call it. So some capacity building or training that's done, which is very similar to what's being done in a lot of the development programs.
Yeah.
And so, for example, there's $8 billion, give or take, of ODA into the ag sector annually. Not all of it is going to focus on private sector related development, but a portion of it. And it operates very much in silo from the impact investing that's happening in agriculture. And our tax money is funding a lot of it on both sides. So I'd just love to see more efficiency. So I would say for those of you that are working in things that are touching on private sector development, think about how your program is connecting with others in the region. Is there a investment fund that FinDev or somebody else is putting money into? Are we making those connections to the private sector organizations? Because there's a lot of inefficiencies in the system, and I think, and there's a lot of money that could be complementary if we were all just connected a little bit more.
I would say look at if gender is integrated into your own approach. So Lindsay shared a really nice QR code that you can do just an assessment. It's a really small step, but it will allow you to see where you're at that point in time before you even decide where you want to go. So that'd be my recommendation. That is a really good framework. I've used it in a couple of different things to analyze stuff. And so take a look at that, take a look at your organization, see where you're at, and then figure out, well, where do we want to go from here?
I very much agree. I think, examining your own biases, maybe in your own incentive scheme, your KPIs, like, is it just, for example, in investment, are you just focusing on volume, or are you also looking at employee retention and, some of those more subtle things that maybe, I don't know, in theory, it could be that men are really good at doing big volume deals, and you're rewarding that without realizing that maybe the women are better at retaining staff and training others and mentoring that, is not in your one big KPI.
Yeah.
One at-home example. Theoretically.
So I'm going to let the other question be asked, and then I've got another one here. So tell us your name and then your question.
Hi, my name is Julie Lefranc. Mouse from Global Affairs Canada.
Okay.
And I'm just curious, you touched on it a little bit towards the end around the role of GLI in trying to mobilize private capital, both from international investors, but also from domestic markets. And you talked about the role of basically ensuring that these MSMEs are ready to be, they're bankable, they're commercially viable in terms of getting access to finance from their local banks in their countries. And then I think, Colleen, you mentioned the sustainability, the need for sustainability models. I mean, impact investing and now GLI, they're really boutique, right? I mean, let's be really honest about this. And what we really need is like systems change or transformation in traditional investment. And so I guess my question is, what do you guys hope for in the future? GLI is pretty relatively new. I think we need more evidence, more data to basically convince private sector. And of course, it depends on the market. Is it a least developed country? You're going to have a hard time getting, regardless, you know, the fiduciary requirements for most commercial lenders is such that even if you de-risk, even if you provide them the data, they're probably not going to be able to accompany you in that investment. But what do you hope for in terms of, say, in 10 years' time? Where will this whole GLI impact investing sit vis-a-vis traditional markets and traditional investors? And maybe what do you think are the key levers or, you know, things that need to really become kind of massive transformative change pieces in order to unlock this and move the needle in terms of moving it from a boutique space to something more mainstream?
I have a first thought on one part. You're asking about the data, and it seems there's two schools of thought. It's like we should show that GLI leads to better results, and that will bring more GLI. And the other school of thought is just women are half of the population, and therefore gender considerations should be included in investment at every level. I'm very much of this school. Like, we should not have to prove that women are better at investing. Like, that's not the point, you know? It's just that maybe women have other concerns, maybe gender just needs to be taken into consideration at every level because it's half of the population, full stop. Like, maybe women aren't even better at investing, it doesn't matter. They might bring in other considerations. And so I'm always insulted when people say like, oh, I included more women in the board and results improved. Like, maybe it didn't improve for them, you know? Women shouldn't have to buy their place by showing that they have better results. My very strong opinion on those two schools of thought. So that'll stop. I'll let you guys.
Well, I'm happy to jump in a little bit. It's a great question. I think, though, taking two steps back, a lot of the challenges with the boutique nature of impact investing has very much to do with the shallowness of capital markets in a lot of the emerging countries in which we're operating. And I think what Jacqueline touched on is they provide a gender screen to public markets, to all of the things that we all have in our various investments. I think we'd all love to see that and those depth of markets happening in a lot of places in which we're investing. But we go through, you know, private equity, private debt, in part because it's one of the few choices that are there. You know, so I think to the point in 10 years' time, one, I'm a little bit in both camps, I have to say. I mean, I don't think we should have to prove it, but it is, we are, like, it is there. And so, you know, I guess the question is, well, why the hell has the rest of the world not gotten onto it? And why is this just not, you know, good investing? And we're seeing that a little bit, I think, you know, in the overall discussions around kind of ESG. I know there's a bit of a backlash from particularly the US, but elsewhere, you know, it's becoming much more commonplace. And so I'd like to see this just much more commonplace. And so I'd also like to see a GLI investment conversation where 90% of the room wasn't women.
Yeah.
You know, you're all welcome, and it's great to have you here, but, you know, and to have, you know, this discussion with a group of you know, male bankers, quite frankly. You know, we're probably preaching to the choir here. I know it's obviously the conference, but these conversations need to happen in different forums, I think. But yeah, you know, so that imagining a world where it's not that unique or that different. But I do think the Equality Fund has shown we can take this lens here, you know, with different methods. Anyways,
Yeah, so I mean, that's my day-to-day job, right? It's like how to grow this field and how to create products and grow them. And I think I think we're at a nascent level of GLI, let's be clear. There's so much more that can be done across asset class. And to Lizzie's point, how do we democratize it? How do we make it available to everybody? Why does it have to be really only through DFIs and private capital? Because most of those investments are not available to everybody, right? Those are very niche products and niche types of investments. So there's the democratization portion of it. So that's going to likely have to come through the public market sphere. Let's be clear. But where we are currently with this public market sphere is that when you look at a gender ETF, and some of them are investors in, they're not incredibly compelling. Let's just put it that way. They are taking a gender lens, and we're looking at gender factors across public market companies. But like I said before, we're not able to invest really in emerging market companies at this point because the gender data isn't there. So hopefully we'll have better gender data. But also, how do we curate within sort of the portfolios and the indexes that are there to really understand and understand gender impacts, but also use shareholder activism as a tool to advocate for change with the public market companies. That is a lofty goal, and that is going to require billions of dollars of capital. How do we get to billions of dollars of capital? Is a big question mark.
That's the question.
And I can tell you, when I'm having conversations with asset managers about creating a new gender ETF or doing something differently, it's cracking that industry is, I feel like it's not just from a gender perspective, it's from an everybody perspective, because that whole industry is so fundamentally painful. So I mean, that is a whole other thing. But yeah, look, I think from a private capital side, there's a lot more impact you can have, you have more flexibility. But let's be clear, it's only certain types of investors playing in that space. It's institutional investors, it's pension funds, it's DFIs to a certain extent. And so, that is sort of the boutique nature of it on the private side. But I think there is a lot of opportunity on the public equity side and public market side. And how do who's doing that will be really, I hope it's not just me.
So, just to add, because we're kind of out of time, that question of gender data, I mean, we take it for granted that we capture things, and it's still a standard practice. If you borrow money from a bank as a business, it's not captured whether it's male-owned, female-owned, woman-owned, man-owned. And that's something that's a huge gap of data that we don't currently have. And so even before we start talking about shifting the needle forward to mainstreaming GLI as part of our overall language and not being boutique, we have to first figure out what actually is there. We think we know what's there, but you don't know what you don't know. And so until we get that data as part of our, as you said, systems change, where it's built into our overall processes, just for general lending, we're not going to get to the point where we figure out, well, let's invest in this area. We had one more question, so I'm going to let her, you can say your name, and then we'll just wrap up with that last set of comments.
Sure, thank you. My name is Diana, I work for World University Service of Canada. I have a question for all of you, but in particular, IGRC colleague. And so, as you're thinking about generalized investing, the care economy, what should organizations working in this space start thinking about, especially as we assess metrics and measurements at the systems level, thinking of sustainability, social norms, decarbonization, so all of those layers. Very easy question, but seeing that they're so interconnected, and we don't want a situation whereby the project has been implemented. So now let's think about how will we have measured this. So what can we have as top of mind moving forward to kind of have these safeguards in place as these kind of programs are unfolding, and we're kind of learning through the process. So what should we be thinking about?
I mean, that's a tough one. There's a lot of things, I think. And this is, probably just because it's kind of IDRC mantra, but I do increasingly believe in localized approaches for this type of thing, local data, exactly what was just said, figure out where the big gaps are in the information and what you actually don't know. Because sadly, I feel like in international development, we still come in with the intervention. Oh, we have a project that we'd like to do on this. Would you like to implement it for us? Rather than actually doing the needs assessment first. And I think on something like care economy, so we have a large partnership right now, which finishes this year together with Gates Foundation and Himmler Foundation in East Africa. And a big plank of that is actually looking at care economy interventions. And, again, I already mentioned it, but the social norms piece has just been like key, understanding what some of the structural barriers are for actually trying to implement and do these types of things. So I think having, for an organization like WUSC, having really strong local partners that you listen to and you really can involve in a meaningful way, I think, it's just good development at the end of the day. And it's really walking the talk that, eventually I think we'd all like to see ourselves be out of business. Some of us, maybe not, maybe not. But I mean, I think all of that really matters. I mean, I'm completely blown away by some of the things that I've heard about here today. Some of the things, but I mean, I think that there's some really fantastic good practices out there. And I also just want to reiterate the call to really think about how you can work with the private sector. I mean, I think we in IDRC, we've struggled with it for years. And I think we're actually just now coming to ground and figuring out like how we can best do that for our organization. And I think every organization needs to do that.
So I want to close this off, but just to end on this note. So we do have different schools of thought in GLI. Some people think formalizing and being in the traditional, we call capitalist economy, is the way to go, because at the end of the day, it's more important to have that integration, particularly when there's like a disaster or something and people have to access help. If they're not formalized, they can't access it. Another school of thought is that we've got these ROSCAs, these rotating credit systems and structures that are informal, that provide financing within families and friends and networks. So while this started our discussion today, this is not the end of it. This is a very vast topic that has different views and opinions, and we hope that today's discussion just kind of piqued your interest a little bit. Feel free to reach out to our presenters, and I want to thank them and you for this wonderful discussion this afternoon. Have a great conference, everyone. Thank you.